Thank you very much indeed for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in UCG, where I worked for 3.5 years back in the 1980s, and got to know and like Galway very much. I'm going to talk about a particular project we've been involved in the past year, which will be published launched in January, entitled Ireland at a Turning Point. But before I do, I might mention, maybe in a sense, address the topic of this particular seminar on social science and policy with a few introductory remarks, and then discuss this particular piece of work, which is about policy, although, as you'll see in a few moments, it's methodologically a departure for us in NESC, a piece of work, and yet we've yet to see, I suppose, whether it has any impact on policy, or what kind of impact it might have. But in reflecting about this session and listening to the very interesting discussion before in the previous session, I think I would encourage certainly the research students to retain a certain interest in methodology, and that in a sense, my experience is that methodology kind of never leaves you alone, it never goes away as an issue. I mean, just in the last year, I've been involved in a number of things. Before I get to the thing I'm going to talk about at some length, where issues of methodology and the relationship between social science and policy come up, continuously come up in different forms. And just when you think you've sort of done that and resolved your methodological position, it comes back. So just in the last year, I've been involved in a workshop comparing Denmark and Ireland. I think some people from Galway were involved on the business side. And that question of an in-depth comparison of Denmark and Ireland, particularly around innovation and aspects of economic and business policy and economic policy, raised a question about whether it's feasible and sensible to compare Denmark and Ireland, or if we take the varieties of capitalism view, is it a bit redundant to compare two countries in these two different worlds, structured so differently. And various people involved in that project, including myself, had to think about that, think through in what sense would it be sensible to compare Denmark and Ireland, and how might you? How could you warrant such a thing in the face of a very institutional view of how these countries differ? I won't give you my particular answer now, it's not of that much interest. Secondly, I was involved in a foresight exercise for the Irish Research Council for Humanities and Social Science, a foresight exercise on the future of humanities and social science. And that report, I think it may have been posted in the last couple of weeks, and it certainly will be launched very soon. But that group, in that group, very profound questions arose. And in fact, someone put their finger on exactly what I think is the key question before the break, which is, do we have a clear and reasonably common conception of the humanities and social sciences, which you might start an exercise like that in the future of Irish humanities and social science with? And the answer turned out to be, well, not easily. And I was surprised in that group, mostly professors in humanities and social sciences in Ireland, how little reflection there was to begin with on the nature of our disciplines. And as a result, that group was grasping around for quite a while on all sorts of ways you might mount a defence of humanities and social science, like they're great for the cultural industries, like museums and filmmaking, or they're so good in themselves that they don't need to justify themselves, or they're so instrumentally good at guiding policy that we justify ourselves, or worst of all, God knows, that our subjects teach people how to think, tell right from wrong, and that's why we're valuable to society. And I was amazed that what we were missing was actually something more searching about the nature of our subjects and what, if there is a common nature. And so I was confronted again with sort of methodological issues which I thought I'd forgotten about. In NESC recently we undertook a social report in which we, for the first time, maybe a bit late, but for the first time, engaged with the emerging science or search of well-being. And that in turn raised difficult issues for us in a conventional sort of economic and social policy advisory entity to access that literature and then to make sense of it, which itself is a complex combination of kind of quite positivistic psychology of recent years, but allied, maybe productively allied, to very ancient streams of philosophy, back to the Greeks. And that in turn pushed us, if you like, into to think methodologically. Needless to say, the crisis has, for a body like ours, which is a body which seeks to build consensus among trade unions, employers, community and voluntary groups, farm organisations and senior civil servants, needless to say, the crisis posed profound challenges, and our first reaction to the crisis with our council made up of those groups was to hope that if we made reference to the body of political economy that we had collectively developed over 20-25 years, that body of agreed analysis or agreed general principles would allow us a take on the crisis, which would in turn lead to a joint or consensus-based response to the crisis. And when we did that, it in fact proved not possible. That for, I suppose, good and bad reasons, that in Ireland and globally, the crisis is such uncharted territory that many results, propositions, beliefs, which seem to be grounded empirically, philosophically, theoretically, that we thought we knew, or the relationship between fiscal policy and output, or monetary policy and output, or the role of wage adjustment in simulating a real depreciation or whatever. Many of the relationships we thought we had agreed on, we couldn't really leverage in the context where, if you like, those relationships were generated in data sets or sample periods which didn't include perturbations of the ones as large as the ones we're experiencing. And so people could validly say, well, I agree to that in those circumstances, but this isn't, the application of that agreed principle in this context isn't as you say it is, and would have to be different, because this context, you know, isn't the same as the context in which we agreed to that approach to fiscal adjustment, or that approach to wage adjustment, or that approach to monetary policy. And so we had to, I don't think the analysis we've done is entirely redundant, but we've had to step back a couple of levels and acknowledge the degree to which our shared understandings, which we thought were very important and very effective, are simply not available in quite the same sense. We were tempted by, at various points, as indeed all the different pillars, the unions, the employers, community groups, farmers and the government, attempted to, in a sense, a rush to certainty, but in a context which is kind of impossible. Now, to be fair to government, they have no option but to rush to a certain kind of certainty or decision. So I won't dwell, if you like, too much on the way in which the crisis has posed a profound challenge to people like myself and our team, who I suppose have been committed, maybe overcommitted, to the possibility of using social scientific analysis to build shared understanding, which in turn is productive of coordination among different groups and different interests in a way that's win-win and productive for society as a whole and for all of them. It's a profound challenge in a sense, and sort of raises the spectre that the whole of 20 years' work was just a blip, in a sense, when such things were possible, but in a more general sense, they aren't possible. And the truth is, we don't know the answer to that, which in a way, maybe, and these things swing back and forth, validates very strongly the work that was talked about before the break and the work which several people from the audience raised, which is maybe work which is less directly in the service of policy and certainly less committed to the possibility of policy consensus. And we may just be one of those periods when other kinds of work would be more advantageous, not that it isn't always advantageous, but more advantageous than the kind of work we've been doing. So my observation would be to continue thinking about methodology, that it won't go away. And as an earlier speaker said, and I think a lot of that it consists in continuously subjecting terms and concepts and categories to scrutiny and critical scrutiny, because when we contest with each other in social science, it seems to me that it's really very often definitions and categories, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but it's the meaning of a particular category. The continued meaning of a category that seemed like a great category to understand a certain group or a certain practice or a certain relationship, and then we lose faith in it and contest it, and have to sort of deconstruct its meaning and maybe invent another category. So I often think social science is much more set theory than causation. And the third observation I would make is that in this methodological, in the need to be continuously or intermittently thinking about methodology, one of the things that always seems to come up again and again, but not all the time, thank God, is this fundamental question in all knowledge of the relationship of parts and wholes. That I think whenever we have a problem, we very often find that issue is in play. And someone referred earlier to the tension between studying whole populations and whole societies, and especially the policy-driven urge or pressure to study, the stressed parts of society, or the people who are displaying particular problems or experiencing particular problems. That's only one instance, but I do think that that issue continuously comes back, and you can see it in the current crisis, in the combination of attempts to do good analysis of particular pieces of our crisis, whether it's consumer behaviour or the impact of quantitative easing on credit, but also then the question of wholes, about how society was operating as a whole, and policy was operating as a whole in a period which seemed to be progressing, but was clearly seriously flawed in the end. So that's just my way, in a sense of introduction. What I wanted to talk about in a little bit more detail is a particular piece of work that we've done in the past year, which the final piece of advice would be always have more than one string to your bow, because as you discovered, your main string can snap and become seemingly useless in the face of events, and having some other thing on the go is very useful, at least even in an expedient sense. So what I want to talk about is a study called the Futures Ireland Project, which the report of which is entitled Ireland at Another Turning Point, Reviving Development, Reforming Institutions and Liberating Capabilities. And I want to talk about the project because it does have some methodological issues, and I suppose it will display us doing some work where we're a bit out of our depth, because it's so different than what we normally do. But let me explain this study. And it's a futures or foresight study, and that's not kind of work that I've ever been involved in, although it's increasingly common, particularly in some parts of the policy system. And the study we were asked to do by the Prime Minister's Taoiseach's Department, Prime Minister's Department, for those who are not familiar with Ireland, was a follow-up to the Information Society Commission. The Information Society Commission reported to the government for 4 or 5 years on the challenge of the information society, and quite properly looked at a range of aspects of information technology, its use, its potential, its dissemination, etc., and advised government on those issues. And government, and indeed the social partners, then became interested in a wider foresight exercise which would explore the possibility of a learning society, a wider term than information society. And we understood that to mean wider in two senses. Wider in the sense of innovation and learning beyond technology, on the one hand, and also wider in the sense of considering the role of wider groups than those involved in technology and science. And so that was the exercise we were given, and in typical fashion, a kind of high expectations on the mandate, but very little guidance on how to execute it. And we were struck by the fact that there have been a significant number of Irish future studies in the last decade. One really influential one on science and technology, which effectively led to the foundation of Science Foundation Ireland, and pointed at the need for a particular focus on biotechnology and high-performance computing. But other technology foresight exercises undertaken in Teagasc, in the Marine Institute, in the Board of Midlands and Western Regional Foresight Exercise. The Dublin Institute of Technology has a whole unit devoted to futures and foresight studies. The Institute of Public Administration published a sort of a public service 2022 foresight exercise in the last year. So, and the general approach of those foresight and future studies is to identify trends and drivers of change, whether it's climate change, peak oil, demography, aging, the geographical pattern of settlement, participation, etc. And to use a series of drivers or trends to identify possible scenarios. If you have 2 or 3 paths for global warming, and 2 paths for peak oil, and 2 or 3 paths for demography and aging, and other paths for transport and technology, you can clearly combine them into a large number of permutations and combinations. And generally those foresight and future studies then reduce those possible many future paths, combining, as I say, the high and low road for oil or demography, whatever, reduce that huge number of possible future paths to 3 or 4, and each of these becomes a scenario, which is then discussed, and usually in this discipline, discussed in a fairly sort of stakeholder-intensive way, involving a lot of actors in discussion of scenarios. And reflecting on that work, we were struck by a number of things, and one is that that kind of work seemed to be most effective when it was fairly narrow in scope, and an organisation, like a service delivery entity or a policy advisory body, did a foresight exercise on its future role and the possible future roles it might have in the society and in the policy system. Then you got some really interesting thought, especially if they used the scenarios as really a kind of a stimulus to deliberation and reflection and maybe dialogue with a range of stakeholders. But where much wider questions were societal questions and economic questions were embraced, we were less convinced that the process of reducing many possible futures to a discussable number was convincing. Secondly, those studies, almost all tend to have an interesting feature that they identify future scenarios and then finish by saying, but which one of these occurs, or which combination of these occur, and whether that turns out to be for good or ill, will depend very largely on the interaction between the economy, the society, and the public system. Whether firms so the future scenario of technology and business will depend. It may be one of these paths, but it will depend on whether firms can rely on the skills of the people they hire, or rely on the commitment, or lifetime participation of the people they hire. Whether the state can engage the commitment of citizens, whether citizens can rely on the state to provide order and services. And we were struck by, but that stuff usually, as Brian referred to the policy recommendations at the end of studies, that tends to be the final page of futures exercises, that we've done all this, but in the end it will depend on the way wealth creation and public governance and society interact. And so we, on the basis of that reflection, we decided to undertake this study on the wider learning society in a somewhat different way. That instead of tracking the trends, and in a sense we were relying on the fact that many of the important trends had already been documented, and we don't know whether that's correctly forecast them, but they'd been documented in all these other studies and didn't require repetition. So instead of tracking the trends, we decided to focus on how people respond to the trends, if you like, how people respond to change, uncertainty and ambiguity, and made that our subject rather than the trends. Secondly, to take the closing observation of many of these foresight exercises and make that our subject, or one of our subjects, that is the interaction of wealth creation, society and public governance. And thirdly, and here we were departing, I suppose, more from this foresight discipline and future studies discipline, to base the study very heavily on experience, on people's experience of innovation and change, with the focus of the study being trying to think about Ireland as a more innovative learning society. We decided to start with experience. And I suppose that approach reflected an intuition and a frustration at the same time. And the intuition was that it may be possible that the way we have been discussing public governance problems, I mean, we in NESC and other public bodies, but also in a lot of research, we've been discussing challenges of public governance in Ireland. We were kind of tired of ourselves in a sense. How many times can you say joined up with government before you get tired of saying it? We were wondering whether the intuition was that maybe the way we discuss and think about some of these public governance problems might be refreshed or reframed, or maybe entirely revised, if we were to take a journey through business and society and come back to sort of public governance and look at it in the light of what we find. So what we did in the study then was form a number of groups. We formed a national advisory panel, a high-level panel of 23 high-level actors from policy, from business, from technology, from academia, to advise us and to bounce ideas off periodically. And we formed a much larger consultative panel of 180 innovators. And this is a consciously biased sample. There's people who'd come to our notice through various sort of search processes as people who had innovated some success in technology, in business, in public service, in the community sector, in research, in universities, in teaching, schools, etc., and use them as a key resource. What we did was begin by convening them in small groups, facilitating small groups, to initially describe their experience of innovation, how they understood their innovation, be it in, say, technology, or in community organising, or in public service, or health services, or whatever. And to, secondly, we were struck by those initial accounts, which we recorded and examined in some depth. Those initial accounts were striking in two respects. One was the degree to which, in telling the story of innovation, they made reference not only to institutional and organisational characteristics, the firm they work in, the school they work in, the department, the community group that they work in, and its features, but also to interpersonal issues and interpersonal relationships that they had to create or fix or repair in the process of achieving whatever innovation they felt they had achieved. And thirdly, not only that, but also not only the interpersonal, but also the intrapersonal or personal, that they made very frequent reference to their own initial motivations and vocations, but also to their own re-examination of themselves, rebuilding capabilities and capacities in order to achieve innovation, and the way in which their identity was challenged and evolved in the process of this innovation. And that was very striking. I mean, some psychologists involved with us, they might have been able to tell us that this was likely, but I suppose for us economists and more conventional social policy analysts, it was a surprise. And the second thing that emerged from those initial accounts was the degree to which these innovators were accessing resources, people, ideas across boundaries. So the people in business were frequently, as we know in Ireland, using and leveraging public entities and public agencies, but also accessing social and community resources in their neighbourhood. And likewise, the people in, say, the social and community sector were surprisingly active in engaging business and in engaging public entities. We termed that this activity, which seemed to be very common in these narratives, cross-fertilisation, that they were cross-fertilising across the boundaries that we had framed. So that gave us rise to a very simple kind of analytical framework, which is only, as I said earlier, it's only categories, really. But if our three interests were society, public governance, and wealth creation, and the way in which they interact with each other, and we put public governance at the centre reflecting our intuition, our, if you like, our hunger, that the way we discuss public governance challenges might be refreshed by looking for a while at social and business practice. Then on the vertical axis, we have those three levels, the institutional, the interpersonal, and the intrapersonal. And that simple framework provided like a map, a grid, on which we were able to map some of these narratives. In other words, we were able to literally put on dots on this picture for some of the cases, and show ways in which the innovators accessed across the boundaries, horizontally across business, across public service, and across society, but also vertically, as in that in many of the cases they showed an ability to align institutional features, interpersonal relations, and personal challenges. Bringing that, and we brought that kind of information and those narratives back to our advisory panel where they were discussed. But what came out from that I mean, a second day of which was more properly future studies oriented, in which we asked the same innovators their vision of Ireland in 2030, and we gave them an exercise around a concrete project in Dublin of the redevelopment of the Great Gorman area, to paint a picture in as much detail as they could of that area of Dublin, if it was in 2030 to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. And that was more in, I suppose, the spirit of future studies. But I'm afraid it was perhaps the most disappointing output of the process, in that people painted the same picture we would have painted ourselves, and they painted the same picture that the high level actors painted when we asked them about a desirable future of sort of ambient technology available throughout the society, of much more flexible public institutions which are accessible through life, whether it's health and education and continuous learning, of much more local decision making as opposed to centralised decision making, of a significant degree, maybe not much more than that, but a significant degree of sort of social capital which allowed communities to thrive. And as I say, that's the same kind of picture was painted by high-level thinkers. We would have painted that ourselves, and by these people who had real achievements to their name. And what everyone struggled, I suppose, to do was to drop behind the surface of that and say, how would that work then? What would make ambient technology available? So what would make public services that were our learning that was available throughout the life course or whatever? And so everyone struggled at that. And what emerged in a way in that discussion on the first one was a very sharp disjuncture in the evidence, in the stories, between an absolute clear willingness to be flexible. These were hyper-flexible people, almost by definition of being innovators, and they found many other flexible agencies and entities to respond. So a real willingness to be flexible, which in a sense we all know in Ireland is there, combined with profound frustration about our collective learning, and profound frustration about the ability of up a level of our institutions, and including the things they were trying to solve, to learn and progress. And that disjuncture became quite a theme that ran through the evidence and in a sense shaped the work we did. And when we brought it back to the high-level actors, they discussed it very much in terms of the inflexibility of much of our policy processes, and the challenge of learning, of accountability, so reflecting with them on that. So what we were starting to see was in a sense, in the initial evidence, public entities having to rely more on businesses, private sector wealth creation, and on society for their achievements. And equally well, we were wondering whether there was a sense, whether the evidence would eventually say something about ways in which what's happening in society and what's happening in business might inform what could happen in public governance. And in reflecting on the very positive evidence, the combination of cross-fertilisation across these spheres and a kind of alignment of institutional, interpersonal and personal capabilities, we were very keen then to explore this issue of learning and with the actors in the final day we had with them. And what we did was develop a tool to explore the way in which those innovators learn, and bringing to that a distinction between two forms of learning and monitoring which are increasingly discussed in aspects of social science, whether it's business, law, European integration, or public services. And that's between compliance monitoring and diagnostic monitoring. Compliance monitoring is based on the idea that the process we're involved in is understood, that X causes Y, and that the action we will take will produce the desired goal. It's also premised on the presumption that the desired goal we're trying to achieve, whether it's better reading scores or employment for people in training courses or health for people leaving hospitals, that the desired goal in turn serves our ultimate purposes in a known way. And finally, if those things are true, then it's more or less sufficient to check compliance with instructions. So if those, say, delivering services, making technology, selling products, teaching children, driving buses, if they comply with the instructions and these other things are true, then we should get the results we expect. And indeed, we might even have to instruct them that much if we created incentives which made them choose the course of action which led to the desired results. But increasingly, people are interested in a different form of monitoring, which applies in situations where we're uncertain about how to achieve the desired outcome. We don't really know that well what makes for faster reading or better recovery or better return to the labour market or whatever, or indeed better flow of credit to businesses. So if we're uncertain about how to achieve the outcomes, and indeed we may indeed be uncertain about what are the possible and desired outcomes, so that we know we don't even know the ceiling of what the maximum what's possible, and we're not quite sure what of the desired outcomes would be. And in that context, we require not compliant monitoring of compliance with instructions, but monitoring, more continuous monitoring, involving a kind of root cause analysis. And this is evident, for example, it's totally familiar and commonplace to business analysts in the form of simultaneous engineering. And increasingly, diagnostic monitoring is evident in firms where they can't ensure safety or quality by writing rules, so they have to install intense procedures to monitor those things. Where innovation involves collaboration between several firms, it requires some kind of monitoring of whether that collaboration is working. Where complex policy problems, what they call wicked problems, where the correct policy can only be really set in the context of doing it, then compliance monitoring is more or less useless to us, and we need something like diagnostic monitoring. So what we did was I asked the innovators to come back and tell us in much more detail, the way in which they conduct themselves and how they learn. And that revealed a quite remarkable stories of a remarkably strong inclination to undertake, willingness and inclination to undertake intense review. So we saw care service providers for people with disabilities, voluntary providers funded by the HSE, before they were asked by the HSE, long before they were asked by the HSE, confronting the fact that their mission was person-centred disability services, and what they actually were providing was old-style semi-incarceration, and they knew that, and their willingness to undertake intense review using very disciplined systems of quality assurance, quality management, to review every piece of the day-to-day life of their care homes. We saw a quite astounding story of a local authority officer who took over control of a dog pound in County Louth, and this dog pound had a sort of 80% slaughter rate of found dogs, were just basically slaughtered, and he first of all he garnered resources by recognising that the local authority had the right to charge for dog licenses, which it never really did, but it had the right. So he did that to raise a small amount of money, and then installed key performance indicators in the dog pound. And the key performance indicator, which he hadn't a clue how to achieve, was percentage of dogs rehomed, and that became the indicator. And then they worked on how might you achieve that goal, and how might you have sub-indicators which would achieve that goal. And within a couple of years, he transformed that dog pound into having an enormous placement rate of found pets, a resource which pet lovers visit every weekend for various services. And then when we pressed him on how he'd achieved those things, he revealed, well, actually, before being sent to take charge of this dead-end piece of local authority business, the dog pound, he was the food inspector in charge of meat plants, where he had a long experience of using hazard analysis and critical control points, which you see in your butcher shop, which is the way food production system identifies in great detail the hazard points in the food chain and focuses on ways in which hazard points of cross-infection can be eliminated. And he effectively had brought this kind of hazard analysis mentality to a dog pound and leveraged the social resource of the love of animals, which was in his local neighbourhood, with this business resource of intense monitoring, and the public resource of the local authority to transform an institution. We saw remarkable stories from the Industrial Development Authority. I won't dwell on the stories too much, but which was very interesting because it revealed a story of an organisation which is a world leader giving out grants, as we know, in the last 30 years, and attracting inward investment to Ireland. Now confronted with the fact that because business has changed and because the state aid rules have changed in the EU, you can't do much of that anymore. And an organisation that had then moved from, it always was very monitoring oriented, like how many businesses did this department or officer capture to Ireland, but then they had to drop down a level and examine in great detail the relationship between their officers and the businesses that they dialogue with, and they had a procedure of bringing that knowledge back, and each officer, if you like, reports in great detail the way in which they have dialogued with Pfizer in Chicago or whatever, and share that with other officers who then, in a sense, learn from that and share their learning. We saw remarkable stories of a time bank in County Cork, which is pure community project, using information technology to identify all the local resources of, who has babysitting time and who has babysitting needs, who wants to learn to drive and who has time to do it. A fascinating feature of that time bank was that more than any multinational you would come across, at least as much as a multinational, this time bank, a kind of whipped up out of nothing community project, had an intense monitoring of every phone call they received to see what was the course of that inquiry and that information. In other words, they were as intensely interested in monitoring how they responded to these casual social connections as a firm would be. I won't go on with the projects, but as I said, there's a mixture of business innovation, of public service innovation, of community innovation in those projects revealed to a quite remarkable extent. And this led us towards, I suppose, the findings of the project, which I'll sort of state here, and then elaborate a little bit on one or two of to finish. And the first is this, is that new forms of cross-fertilization between the economy, society and public governance are increasingly evident, and that this enhances the ability to learn and to innovate. I mean, a bit schematically perhaps, we could characterize, goodness knows we've heard of it in the last few days, but there was always, of course, an intense relationship between economy, society and wealth creation. How could there not be? But there was a sense in the Ireland of old that while that was always, of course, a relationship, it was, if you like, a more distant one. Is that, in a sense, citizens were created in the school and the church and available to the economy, the school and the church and the home, available to the economy for use or export, and the public service provided a kind of order around all of this. But the operating disciplines of those three spheres were essentially quite different. And the cross-fertilization we're talking about is the phenomenon whereby the operating practices are at least more similar and certainly cross-fertilized across these spheres. That is that business is, for example, more involved in creating and recreating skills, not just taking citizens created by schools and colleges than it was, but also in leveraging social resources. Social movements and organizations learn enormously from business on these practices, but also become teachers to the state in how to produce tailored services, etc. So that's the first one. The second finding is this. This is really based on the evidence that I outlined a moment ago, that innovation and learning are systematic, not idiosyncratic, and that they almost always, based on this small sample, I'll be honest, almost combine initiative, disciplined review, and a willingness to confront challenges at three levels: institutional, interpersonal, and personal. What the stories conveyed was, with a very high frequency, was organisations that when they undertook this review, and that review revealed, of course, successes and also revealed problems, they developed a capacity to address those problems, whether they were the institutional level, at the interpersonal level, or sometimes the challenge to the individual. And we were very struck by that. Thirdly, that systematic review of the kind we're talking about provides the basis for both innovation and accountability, and that this is particularly relevant in a period when we seek more stability on the one hand, and at the same time we seek more accountability, and yet we seek these in a context which involves a lot of radical change. And this in a way is maybe more surprising, because we tend to think, certainly those of us who come from the public sector, tend to think as innovation and accountability as two desirable things, but they're at odds with each other. That you can have innovation, but that's disorder, or risks disorder, and certainly risks accountability, or you can have accountability, and that provides order, but it stifles innovation. And what's striking, I mean, whether this can be generalized or not, what's striking, at least in a significant number of the cases, in firms, in social organizations, and in public entities that do this kind of intense learning, intense review, is that that systematic review can sometimes be the basis both of innovation and accountability. So we heard in one of the cases in our study was the geriatric services in St James's Hospital in Dublin. And there, the professor of geriatric medicine described to us the way in which they developed the unit and the way in which they developed the diagnostics on falls for elderly people, which of course is a huge reason for hospitalisation, etc. And then the way in which they developed procedures to predict and respond to falls and to track people away from accident and emergency straight into a more focused geriatric service. And then this in turn led to much reduced stays in hospital and less frequent returns to hospital, etc. Now what was striking about that was, of course, like all the good clinical teams, although the good ones, he was using this intense form of review and peer review with other medics. But what he was also able to do, at least in part, was put that information between covers and make that a significant part of his bid for resources and his form of accountability to the system. And that is striking because and this comes to the fourth point, but in other contexts, we saw groups in schooling, public schools, state schools, but also in voluntary groups who undertake this intense form of review in order to do the day job better all the time, and then have to do a completely other form of, dare I say, nonsense reporting to the funding authority in order to be accountable to an authority that won't accept, if you like, their intense review, even where it involves external oversight, which it often does, and instead they have to do this form of reporting, which nobody really reads, so the positive result is striking. Whether it's general, I don't know. But certainly we know from wider innovation studies that it's not just idiosyncratic, it's not just a single finding that accountability and innovation can be, at least in part, fed by the same systematic review processes. So that brings us to our final finding, which is, after all of that, but the kind of innovation and learning that we found in this sample can flourish and can yield their full harvest without profound change to our organisational systems, particularly our system of control and accountability in the public sector. That finding is in many ways based on taking this evidence from this 180 innovators back to this 23-person high-level group, several of whom were secretary generals of departments, others of whom were heads of technology units or firms or senior actors in other organisations, and their chewing over that evidence was that we face a real urgent need to move from very strong compliance monitoring in our public system towards something more like something involving greater autonomy, but combined with much more intensive review, and quite strikingly, in a way, we finished that part of the report by showing that the government's own response to the OECD report actually puts its finger on this very thing, the need to move from input control to greater review of outputs and outcomes, and to make whatever changes, and they are profound changes, I think, to organisations and indeed career definitions that's involved in that. But I want to finish with the turning point, if I can. Skip over that. And the final discussion in this paper is sort of stepping back from that evidence to reflect a discussion that was held in this high-level group, and it's this: it's that there is a view, we're certainly at a turning point, I think you could safely say, of some kind, and there's a view that we're at a very perilous turning point, that on the economy, Ireland's lead position in the attraction of foreign investment of the past 30 years is possibly gone. We've got new rivals in Asia particularly for that, and for that and a number of reasons, the basis of Ireland's prosperity won't be as good in the future as it has been in the past. Secondly, there's a view with that the recent success of the last 20 years in Irish society and the Irish economy was, if you like, based more on social capital built up over earlier decades than we recognised. But effectively we consumed this social capital and we haven't replaced it. And so we thought it was all the market, and really it was the market and education and a whole bunch of other social capitals. But we didn't know that second and third bit, and so we didn't pay enough attention to them, and now it's gone. And thirdly then, that we had a positive conjuncture of strategic policy direction in governments from late 80s, we'll say, to the present, combined with social partnership, which involved the key actors on behalf of unions, employers and others, acting in concert, together. And that's gone, as it seems to be. And that all in all then, it's pretty bleak that on all these fronts we're at a turning point, and in none of these spheres of the economy, society or public policy can the next bit be as good as the last bit. But there's also, based in part on the evidence, but there's also another view you could take, that on the economy, that if technology was a window of opportunity for Ireland in the last 2 decades to sort of leap up the world league table of prosperity and income per head, that technology in future can be more of an enabler of opportunities. Carlota Perez has written about this in Yochai Winkler, that she argues that we are at sort of halfway stage in the ICT revolution. And if the last 2 decades or 3 decades was the installation of information communications technologies, and now she says we're having a predictable crisis, and the next couple of decades will be the full deployment of information and communications technologies, and that will give rise to a myriad of social, business and policy possibilities as ICT really diffuses throughout the world and throughout society. And that will create enormous business opportunities for prosperity. Secondly, this is based on the evidence. The first step is kind of, I suppose, a proposition or a theory. You could say, well, maybe some social capital is gone, but huge capabilities are not being put to use. And it's not values that are in short supply, but institutional contexts which allow people to use their capabilities to the full. And thirdly, maybe the future of public policy won't be as bleak. First of all, maybe it wasn't as good in the last couple of decades as that first picture says, and that there's a real chance to move from the Irish state being very innovative, as an earlier speaker referred to being more genuinely experimental, as in learning, to move from bookkeeping to a more genuine accountability, and that there's actually a harvest of improved public services waiting to be garnered in all sorts of spheres, if the little bits of evidence we have are reliable. And that's, I suppose, the point on which that particular study finishes, suggesting the possibility of both a negative and a positive reading of the turning point. Thank you.